Pope Francis no longer silent nearly 1 week after a grand jury report detailed decades of sexual abuse on more than 1,000 children by Catholic priests in Pennsylvania, and extensive efforts to cover it all up. CNN's Polo Sandoval live in Pittsburgh with more. Polo.
Well, John, we had heard from the Vatican in the days following the release of this report, but not from Pope Francis until today, as you point out. The Holy Father now acknowledging with shame and repentance, his own words, that the Catholic Church failed to do enough and acted quick enough to acknowledge the pain and suffering that it had caused decades ago on so many young people. Another portion of his letter that was just released today that stands out, I can read for you directly here. Pope Francis writing, looking ahead to the future, no effort must be spared to create a culture able to prevent such situations from happening, but also to prevent the possibility of their being covered up and perpetuated. That cover-up portion certainly is something that is going to stand out to people here in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. The reason why we are here this morning is because about a third of the clergy members that are listed in that very damaging and disturbing report were from this diocese. So that is why we have been attending masses here, speaking to members of the congregation. And many people here say that these apologies from the Vatican to local church officials is simply not enough. They want a full admission from the Catholic Church of what they believe has been decades of covering up these kinds of atrocious acts. And I should tell you that the Pope's message this morning, certainly echoing what we have heard from church leaders here in Pittsburgh. The head of the diocese here in the last few days, Allison, has made very clear that there are many changes that are being instituted, not just decades ago, but also in the last several days. Now, the question, Allison, is will those changes be enough? We hope to hear from some of those survivors of this clergy abuse later today here in Pittsburgh.
Okay, please bring those to us when you have them, Polo. Thank you very much. Joining us now is a survivor, Juan Carlos Cruz. He's a survivor of sexual abuse by a priest in Chile. He recently met with Pope Francis at the Vatican. Juan Carlos, thank you so much for being back on New Day. Before we get to the Pope's response, I just want to get your reaction to this grand jury report of what happened in Pennsylvania. I mean, the magnitude of the abuse that they found. Let me put it up on the screen for people. 1,000 identifiable victims, 300 predator priests who were just repeat offenders for years. This happened over 70 years in 6 of Pennsylvania's Catholic dioceses. What did you think when you read of the enormity of this?
So, Allison, thank you so much for having me again. You know, it is heartbreaking. I can only, you can't find the right words to say something when you hear of a horror like that. What survivors go through, because it's just it's like a bullet that stays in your body and travels around and hurts you constantly. I've had friends, as I told you last time, that have committed suicide because they just can't bear. And the Pope says in his letter that the sexual abuse of anybody carries effects that are long-lasting wounds that damage people forever. And so when you hear of something like what happened in Pennsylvania, and I live in Philadelphia, I'm here in Chile now, but it's horrific, Allison.
Yeah.
You just can't find the right words of what people suffer and go through.
And Juan Carlos, just to give people a sense of, again, the numbers here, I'll just put up this next graphic in terms of the predator priests. 37 of them in Allentown, 20 in Greensburg, 45 priests in Harrisburg, 99 priests accused of this in Pittsburgh, 59 priests in Scranton. I mean, the numbers are just so staggering of how this was allowed to happen.
They're staggering.
Seemingly with impunity.
Yeah.
And when you met with the Pope, what did he tell you about this?
So obviously the Pennsylvania report had not been out. It wasn't out yet because we met in the early May. I spent a week with him speaking. But clearly, things that you can see in this letter are things that we talked about. There's new language now from the Vatican, which is important to consider. They talk about crimes. They talk about a culture of death. They talk about a culture of abuse and cover-up. Those things were not talked about before. Before they were omissions, sins, which is terrible to consider those things. In Pope Francis's letter earlier in the month, he talks about going to local justice. You know, how bishops don't turn the perpetrators to local justice because they're not obligated to do so. And that is a horrible crime. And as you see, those numbers are absolutely staggering. So, Allison, for me as a survivor, and what's happening in Pennsylvania is just, you'll see it's 50 states. Pennsylvania is not a unique case.
Yeah.
It's all over the US, all over the world. I'm here in Chile, where the Cardinal Archbishop of the capital city of Santiago tomorrow is going to testify in front of the jury as a target witness of cover-up. So it's all over the world.
Yes.
It's horrific.
Well, Juan Carlos, I just want to end on this because this is something that the Pope just released in his letter, and I found it so moving. He says, the victim's outcry was more powerful than all of the measures meant to silence it, or sought even to resolve it by decisions that increased its gravity by falling into complicity. The Lord heard that cry and once again showed us on which side he stands. It sounds to me like the Pope heard you.
That's exactly what I personally talked about with him. First for 3 hours, then with my two friends, we talked for 2 hours, and through the week that I spent with him. Those were the exact words that he used. So I am glad that he's coming out with this, and I'm glad that he is speaking out and calling it like it is. I also commend, for example, Representative Mark Rossi in Pennsylvania, who is working on a bill to end the statute of limitations and give a window even for survivors for 2 years. It's been tabled since April 2017, and Allison, the church is lobbying for the statute of limitations not to pass. I think that has to end. They have to lobby to help survivors, not to fight them.
Yes, understood. Juan Carlos Cruz, thank you for all of your candor and for being willing to go public with your story. Obviously, it has had an impact. Thank you.
And I want to thank you guys for putting a light where they want to put darkness. Thank you so much.
We'll talk again.